sharing her knowledge of West African textiles with us and how they relate to the textile traditions in Georgia.
I'm going to do a slideshow today in two parts. In the first part, you will see what 40 years of dashing around the world, searching for peace textiles has brought me with pleasure. And in the second part, I hope to show some of the characteristics that men and women of the African diaspora, both here in especially South Georgia and in Africa, what we have in common. My work begins with plain, usually plain white fabric, and currently I'm making out of that fabric, I'm making accessories. In the past, when I had a partner and a lot more stamina, I worked with much larger fabrics. But now it's down to small pieces, and of course the pieces will in the future include pieces to put story quilts together. You can see in the first slide the plain white fabric, and you can see the color is added and it's subtracted. Finished garment in the form of a dress and I no longer do those large pieces. But I do scarves and bags, and you can see some of my things in the African market. I had promised in 1969, when I actually began dyeing fabric, that I would simply be mindful of quilts. Never ever intended to make a quilt. But I visited families and I just started asking, well, do you have quilts? And here was one of the many hundreds of quilts that I saw. And this family collection was stored between the mattress and the box springs, like so many of them. It was when I saw the necktie quilt that my interest really peaked. This is one of hundreds, and some families only had one quilt, but this was these were quilts by, I think, maybe two of them you see here, by a woman in Tifton, Georgia, who, just as a hobby, had made quilts and preserved them nicely. And that was the status of the quilts that I saw. This is a quilt that I saw just one day when I was walking down the street. And I said, let's just test this. So I knocked on the door, and this elderly woman came to the door with her grandson. And I said, do you have a quilt? She said, yeah. And I said, well, let me see it. Can I make a photo of it? And so that was what, and so the story is that you can knock on almost any door in the Black community, and someone will bring something forth, and it'll be interesting. This was, I started walking through alleys, and I live in a community where people would put had their furniture on the porch. And I saw a quilt like this. I saw many quilts like this. They're just bundled up as stuff to lay on when you're working on your car. And also a few young people, Carolyn Mendez, who lives in town. These women belong to the Dorcas Sewing Club of Tifton, Georgia. And I hope that they taught me a lot about sharing and giving as a piecework artist. They made quilts and other supplies people who were not well, who needed them in their community. Eventually, this work was presented in the form of an exhibit called Make Do, African Americans and Crafters in Central Georgia. And this was one of the scenes. You can see a quilt on the right. Eventually, someone realized, I did, but someone realized that I had a lot of pieces of scraps of fabric that I had started maybe going in such and such a direction, and Nancy Anderson at the Museum of Arts and Sciences invited me to do a quilt show there. And because there wasn't enough time for me to really, she didn't invite me to do it, she invited me to do a one-woman show. And I wanted to do kites, I wanted to make kites, but because the time was so short between the suggestion and the opening, I just decided to call on what I had an experience with, and that was with the quilt. So that's why I became a quilter. This was one of the easy transitions from clothing that I had been making to piece and quilted work, and it's called Money Coat. And you can see I'm right there in the middle of that $1 million bill where I always wanted to be. This was Family Tree, and it was my family's photos transferred onto fabric and pieced together. It's a huge 90 by 100 quilt, and the falling leaves of my mother and the neighborhood photographer. And in fact, it's not just my immediate family, but it's the community that I grew up in, where we were all related in some way. And for that occasion, I mentioned I would just love to have seen great-grandmother Lucindy, and Aunt Josie goes to a trunk and pulls the photo of my great-grandmother out to go in the center of the quilt. So it's like Kyra says, just ask. These were commissioned works for the Taft Museum about the life of Robert Scott Duncanson. And I'll show you one little detail, and that is how in the 1930s, when the city of Cincinnati received the home of the Tafts as a gift, they began stripping the walls in renovation, and there they discovered the paintings, the murals of Robert Duncanson, who was one of the very early African-American painters. And so that was my feeling about what the experience of stripping the walls must have been like. This is She, and it's about the women of Central Georgia, and She is Sheila in the Ethiopian language. And here you can see how one quilt element was placed in that quilt. I wanted to feature the clothing that was made by the wife of Darwin Leo Moss. And that's a photo of Ida, and this is how I photographed her, and this is how she gets pieced and stuffed in the surface of the quilt. And I think I found my niche in the storytelling techniques that I do, and this is called Home Alone. And it's a day in the life of a young child, a latchkey child, who spends his day from early morning until evening looking at television, singing ballads and so forth.